So, welcome to another episode, and this episode is going to be about die studies. And in fact, all of the episodes in this slot are going to be about die studies for the foreseeable future, because I've got a particular project that I'm working on, and I'm going to use this as a kind of research diary, and you can follow along with me as to what I'm doing. And the project I'm working on is related to the last episode. I was kind of thinking through afterwards, what's the largest die study anybody has ever done? And I actually know what the answer to that is. It's Britta Marmer's Anglo-Scandinavian coinage. But I don't own a copy of Britta Marmer's Anglo-Scandinavian coinage. And at the point I'm recording this, I'm still trapped in the house. So I settled for the next best thing, which are Roman Republican coinages. And when I looked at that, I started to find some interesting things, which I thought it would be worth pursuing. But before I can tell you about any of that, and before I can explain this behind me, which is probably not the largest die group ever published, but is certainly one of the contenders for that title, I have to explain why Roman Republican coins are interesting for die studies and why die studies are interesting for Roman Republican coins. And that means to some extent a basic introduction to the Roman Republican Denarius. Here we go. In the 2nd and 1st century, the Roman Republic expanded to be the dominant power of the Mediterranean, and the period we are particularly interested in falls between 126 and 63 BC. If you are unfamiliar, and my channel is more often about South Asia than Europe, so you might be, the Roman Republic by this time had adopted the denarius as its main silver issue. And most coins for Roman territory were made in the city of Rome. The denarius is a silver coin weighing about 4 grams, similar in design, the bust of a god and some figural representation, but slightly lighter than the classical Athenian dram. They look like this. In fact, it is specifically coins of this type that I will be looking at. And what makes the denarii of this specific period so interesting are the systems of control marks that are employed by the mint. For about 60 years, in that period from 126 to 63 BC, it was common practice to place small marks on the obverse or reverse of the coin. Some of these are symbols, sometimes letters, and sometimes Roman numerals, and occasionally a combination of these things. It is not clear why the mint did this. Control marks are not unique to this period or to this mint, but they are usually not as elaborate or as varied as these are, and no one really understands why. The most recent article I know of is by Rick Wichonsky, in which he summarises the various theories and even offers one himself. Unfortunately, his theory isn't sound, so I won't be going into any detail on it. So that is a big question specifically for Roman Republican numismatics. But it is not the kind of thing that would be interesting to any other field. Control marks can do all sorts of things, and working out why they are on these coins won't help you understand control marks on Lake Kushan or medieval English coins. The reason that these coins have become of general interest for die studies are down to the issues made under a moneyer called Publius Crepusius, who ran the mint in approximately 82 BC. These are what his denarii look like. In case you're interested, I'm getting these images from a site called Coin Archive. Coin Archive amalgamates together auction catalogue entries, and it goes back about 20 years, so it does that from about 2000 onwards. It's been doing that very systematically for about 5 or 10 years now, so it creates a very large body of useful data. Before the existence of Coin Archive, people literally had to go to libraries and work through coin auction catalogues one at a time through every single catalogue in a library. There's a really big one in Greece. There's a very comprehensive one in Cambridge. I'm not sure where the best resource in the United States would be, probably the American Numismatic Society. And this is a horrible, tedious task. Having it in a database form, at least for the last 20 years, hugely simplifies it. And as we'll see later when I talk about what I did, we'll see that it made it very easy for me to gather a large amount of data to investigate questions I was interested in. I want to draw attention to a number of features. The first one is the name, P. Crepusi, in the lower part of the reverse. That part of the coin is known as the exurg. This is the name of the moneyer who was appointed to run the mint. And this is hugely important for die studies. You see, there are no die studies of large, complicated ancient minting operations. No studies of the classical Athenian owl at the height of empire. No good studies of London in the Middle Ages, or of the major mints of the Mughal Empire. And there is a good reason for that. Die studies become dauntingly impractical beyond a few thousand coins, and any of those would require getting to grips with tens of thousands of examples. But not the Republican issues, because the Romans appointed their moneyers on an annual or even shorter basis. Crepusius, for example, was one of 3 moneyers who issued coins in the year he was appointed. And that is a huge benefit for die studies, because it breaks a large-scale complex minting into discrete chunks. A few thousand coins is enough to make sense of this if you only have to look at 1 year and not the decades that the same design was employed at Athens, London or Delhi. And about 4 or 5 of the moneyers from this period have been subject to published die studies, though Crepusius is not one of them. The data to prepare a die study for Crepusius was gathered by an American numismatist called Giles Carter. Now, I never knew and didn't meet Giles Carter, and he died in 2010. But a few years after his death, I was approached by Ted Buttrey. And Ted said to me that he'd been given all the data that Carter had accumulated and was planning to publish it as a final study of the Crepusius coins. So he was approaching me because he wanted to incorporate some inter-die analysis in there, and he was asking whether or not once he was further along with the project, I would be willing to step in and do that. Unfortunately, Ted Buttrey died in 2018, and I don't know where the data went after that. But Crepusius is exceptional, even within Roman moneyers. And the person who spotted that was Hirsch in 1952. Doesn't take a particularly close examination to realise that when you find the same marks on a Crepusius coin, that you also find the same die. And Hirsch went a step further by recording the relationship between the obverse symbol and the number on the reverse, encapsulated in this graph he published at the end of the article. The symbols, it transpires, represent batches. The letters, the sequence of production within that batch, and the reverse dies were numbered in order. This might seem like an obvious system. Number your dies. It's so obvious to a modern mind that I've encountered Roman numismatists who assume that because it's true for Crepusius, it's true for all Republican coins. It's not. In fact, Crepusius is almost unique in the production of pre-modern coinage. This is not just the only time in the Roman Republic that a large coinage is treated like this, it's the only time any production of coins is treated like this in the whole of human history. And again, we don't know why. However, just because you don't know why something was done doesn't mean that it's not useful to know what was done. Carter used the Crepusius coins in 1983 to examine models of how many dies survive in a modern sample of coins. This would ultimately lead him, independently of Warren Este, who had to depend on a huge corpus of Greek die studies, to the formula ND over N minus D for calculating the original number of dies that were employed given the surviving coins. It's worth saying a little bit about why I recommend the use of this formula. There is good reason to believe that it's an accurate measure, or at least as accurate a measure as any of these things ever can be, of the number of coins that were originally made. But the main advantage it has is that it's really easy to remember. Multiply the number of coins you have by the number of dies you have, divide them by the difference between the number of coins you have and the number of dies you have. You can remember the formula in your head and thus you can apply it easily. And that's the main advantage. Quite often when you're doing any sort of research, simply having a tool that you can have at your fingertips is inherently useful in and of itself. This being the first case where data from a die study can be compared against a coinage whose original use of dies was known, made it immensely valuable in a lot of the die studies work in the 1980s and 90s, which was particularly focused on the question of how many coins were made, culminating in a famous debate between Decalati and Buttrey in the pages of the Numismatic Chronicle. And that meant it was important even if you didn't give a jot for Roman Republican coinage. So that is why Roman Republican coinage matters. The control marks appear to record in a very detailed fashion an element of the production system. Now, just to be clear, in most cases, they do not number the dies. In many cases, they do not individually identify the dies, but they are frequently sequencing marks of some sort. So they tell us something about what order the dies were made in, and that provides an interesting test against the information we might extract from an interdie analysis. And that is where I became interested. The coinage I'm going to talk about is that of Lucius Julius Bursio, and it does not use the same system as Crepusius. This is an example, from Coin Archives again, of a coin of Bursio. We can see his name in the excerpt, and some of the control marks employed. On the obverse behind the head is a trident, and then to the left of the trident a symbol. On the reverse there are a pair of letters above the horses. The latter are sequencing marks of some sort, but they are not numbering the dies. Firstly, there are lots of obverse dies with the same symbol. As an example, here are 5 coins, all from different dies, featuring the same staff symbol on the left hand of the obverse. On the reverse, while these are clearly marks that were applied in sequence, and they do appear to be unique to the dies, no single system is employed through the whole issue. We get coins with numbers on them, we get coins with a pair of letters, both above and below the horses, and we get a system that combines dots and vowels. And most curious of all, a large group of dies that have no mark on them at all. It's that last group that is particularly perplexing. They constitute nearly a third of all the dies. And if you have a good reason to mark one set of dies, why not mark all the dies? And if you don't need to mark the dies, why mark any of the dies? There is an existing die study of these coins, published by De Ruyter in 1997. This is the largest die study of Roman Republican coins published to date, and it features a particularly large die group, which Ruyter refers to as linkage 103. It's linkage 103 that attracted my attention, and which I will talk about in part 2.